Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Expert to Authority show. And today we have a special guest, and we're going to talk about asking smarter questions. So, for too long, the simple act of asking questions has been overlooked as too trivial to contemplate. And Asking Smarter Question, which is the new book from Master Data Storyteller Sam Knowles, champion the art of curiosity. By making every question count, you can make your organization less confrontational, more collaborative, and more productive. And today we are going to talk about the 6 universal principles of making smarter questions. And at the end, we will also reveal what is the best question in the world to ask. Sam, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much, Simone. I'm doing very well indeed, and thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, it has been a while. We met it has been an episode in the making because we met at the Professional Speaking Association about 6 months ago, I think.
It was February. Yeah, it was February. It was when it was still really exciting to re-meet in the real world.
It's like, oh my God, we are back in the room.
Mm.
It was that kind of moment.
It
And
was
for
fantastic. Yeah,
speakers, saying we are back on a live stage, stop
I
talking to
know.
camera. And you delivered a great presentations about asking smarter questions, and that's what caught my attention. I thought that it would make a great episode. Uh,
Cool.
Before we go into what we're going to talk about today and asking smarter questions, how did
Hmm.
you get interested in that topic? Because I don't think it's one of these things when you were a kid and you said, when I grow up, I want to ask smarter questions. I don't think it's one
Well,
of
it's
these situations.
Well, it's very interesting you should say that. I mean, no, that would not be the case. Although there's an anecdote in the book where I talk about one of my brothers who was an academic in the UK and the US, and whenever he used to visit when I was growing up as a kid, he used to come by and see my parents. Whenever he used to visit, well, one he was a scientist, so he was really good for helping with biology and chemistry homework in particular. But two, he would always after dinner, after lunch, or over the weekend he'd always ask us a really interesting question. And there's an anecdote in the book all about the best question I think he ever asked, which is how many pairs of scissors are there in the world? And of course, I've been around, knocking around for a long time. This was before the internet, and the point of that question was not to get an accurate answer. The point of the question was a kind of thought experiment to develop kind of skills and strategies in critical thinking. How I got into the area of asking smarter questions is this. I, in kind of day-to-day consultancy and training and coaching and mentoring, I help individuals, teams, and companies make better use of data at a philosophical, but also at a deeply practical level.
Right.
So if you're going to make better use of data, I think there are 3 things that you need to do. And the first of those, I mean, I've written 3 books in this area. I happen to write them in the wrong order, but that doesn't matter. History won't remember that. I'm just revealing that to you, Simone, and to the listeners. But people won't remember that. But there are 3 things that you need to do. The first thing you need to do is to ask the right questions to surface the right data. You might say that sounds a trivial thing, but I think it's one of these things that isn't trivial and has been overlooked for too long, as you said in the introduction. The second thing, once you have the right data, is that you can then use that data to really understand the market, the customers, the competitors, the colleagues. If you have the right data, you can get profound and useful understanding of those that you're looking to influence. That profound and useful understanding, another way of expressing that is insight. That was the second book. And then once you have insight, genuine insight into the lives of those that you're looking to influence, well, then you can tell more powerful, more purposeful, data-driven stories. So I'm fascinated by the way that companies and organizations are overwhelmed by data, and it's my mission to help them get through that overwhelm and to use data smarter.
And in this way, you can use. That's what I remember actually about the workshop that you did when we met at the PSA. of helping us retelling our own story through some pieces of data about our business. And that sometimes is often overlooked because
Yeah.
it's almost like data and stories, they happen on two different levels, on two different planes. Can you talk about why that happens and why normally organizations or businesses don't integrate data and stories and they almost happen to live separately?
I think it's really interesting, and I think it happens for a couple of reasons. One is that in most countries around the world, the further and further you go through education, the more specialized you become, either in, let's characterize it as the storytelling craft in the arts, or in the craft of using data, and that is sciences and mathematics. I think that in the modern knowledge economy, actually, those people that thrive and survive are those who are able to bridge that gap. But I think there's a problem with education that makes us specialize in one way or another, first at school, then through university, and then in the world of work. Whereas, in fact, every job, I think, think about in human resources, think about in people management, think about in analytics and insight, think about in marketing communications. Every role in every organization really these days requires people to make use of data and to take that data and to have it as the foundation of their storytelling. But because we've been trained at school and beyond and in the world of work, because we've been trained to be one thing or another, it's very hard to bring those two things together. The world of stories and statistics, of narrative and numbers, are traditionally poles apart. As I say, I'm on a mission to bring those two back together, because I think if you join them together, you get something very, very much more powerful. I think the other reason that there has been a divide is that there's a problem in psychology, or a misunderstanding in psychology, that we are either so-called left-brained or right-brained, right? If you're left-brained, you are analytical, and if you're right-brained, you're creative. Well, in fact, the fact that hopefully, you and the listeners, the viewers are understanding this discussion, the fact that there may well be an end to this sentence that I'm speaking now, the fact that that we're building this dialogue between one another, depends on about 150 discrete units or subroutines or locations in both the left and the right side of the brain that are interacting together. I generate words with a bit of the brain here, and I string them together into sense here. You decode them into sense here, and then you understand the individual elements over here. But they're working in tandem. But I think popular psychology, and particular popular media misrepresentation of how the brain and therefore how the mind works, says we are either left-brained or right-brained. We're either artists or scientists.
Left brain or right brain. There is instead of looking actually both parts of the brain, they both work for you.
And they certainly do, and they work in partnership. And it's just too simplistic. But as creatures, we like a simple explanation. We like to say, this war was caused by oil, or this election was won because of for this reason. But in fact, lots of things interact with one another, and our brains mislead us to try and find simple single factor solutions, whereas in fact they're much more complex than that. And we, as creatures, as top down and bottom up processing creatures, we use the whole of our brain rather than just one side or the other. So I think those are two reasons why: school and psychology.
And that goes for me now the other question. Before we go into, as we are talking about question, I've got another question.
Sure. Good. Of course you have.
Which is why bother? Why should company bother, and organizations and businesses, to actually go the extra mile to find the data, convert the data into stories? And of course, that's where you come in. But what are the real benefits for a company? Because
great question.
Been working. Like I've been working also without it. And so, what's the benefit? Why should I bother doing that?
impact is the simple answer. If you do join these two things together, you are very much more likely to be very much more impactful. So, the world is a complex, well, it's a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous place these days. It's never been more so. Margins are tighter and tighter than they have ever been. The differentiation between companies that do whatever they do is getting closer and closer. And I think that this is one of the largely untouched areas that's going to allow companies to really differentiate themselves and have greater impact. If you can join these two things together, you can communicate with more impact, and your potential customers, your current customers, will know whether or not they should engage with you. So it's all down to impact. If you pigeonhole and keep apart the data and storytelling, data and storytelling is great because what it does is it balances. If you become a compelling data storyteller, you balance the emotional and the rational, and we make our decisions emotionally and we justify them rationally. We need both bits in there.
Yeah.
We need the left brain and the right brain. We need the ancient reptilian brain in order to make those decisions. So it's all about impact.
I really like it. Thank you for the answer, because that's what's the missing piece. So we know that data are powerful, and this is what gets people to pay attention and actually to give validity to something that can be a theory or a claim. In this case, can be a marketing claim, or it can be a claim that you're making to put a new policy in your work environment, whatever it's going to be, whatever that claim is. But also we need the story, because we make sense of the world through stories. And so now we have the emotional part and the logical part together.
Exactly. No, you are completely right. We know from our earliest age onwards, we make sense of the world through stories, and there are some very simple and quite universal elements to story structure. We like a three-part. We like a beginning, a middle, and an end. We like there to be turning points in stories. And if stories are missing those elements, then we find them unsatisfying and we look somewhere else. So we need both to obey the rules of great storytelling that were set out by the ancient Greeks 2,500 years ago and more, and have endured ever since, particularly in the Western tradition, but actually globally. So there are the elements of storytelling. But then if you overlay those with the proof that you can get, the validation you can get from nimble and agile use of just a few numbers, not drowning people in numbers. Drowning people in numbers is completely counterproductive. They turn off. But if you can fuse those two together, the emotional and the rational will be balanced, and you will have more impact. It's a small promise, but I see it happen time and time again with companies that I work with when they really get a handle on how to bring those two things together.
We can understand why we have the emotion and logic working together. So now, just for everyone who's been listening or watching, we have digressed a bit. The reason why I wanted to digress and took a step back is to look at the bigger picture, because of course we are still talking about questions, and we are now going into the topic of questions. But now I want to put things into context of why do we even ask those questions in the first place? Because the right questions are helping you collect the right data so that you can turn the data into story and you can make a bigger impact. But the starting point, that's where it all starts, is with the right questions. And when I was preparing for this interview, you mentioned that there are 6 universal principles of asking smarter questions, and that piqued my curiosity. I want to know what these universal principles now are. So tell us.
They're grandly and loftily called universal principles, probably with a capital U and a capital P. I was really interested when I worked out that I wanted to look into this much overlooked, and as you said in the introduction, kind of almost too trivial to contemplate. If you think about, let's go back to school again, school and the workplace. What are we rewarded for? We're rewarded for answers, right? We're rewarded for in school exams. Our bosses come to us and they say, why is the Swedish team outperforming the Scottish team? What's happening here? We need to understand. So we're rewarded for using analytical thinking to come up with answers to questions. It's answers in exams rather than questions that get the marks. But actually, if we don't step back and think about the type of questions that we ask, and the way that it's not, as the old song has it, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Well, it's both what you do, it's what you ask, and how you ask it. If you don't put some thought and some effort into understanding how to ask genuinely smart questions, not leading questions, not closed questions, not biased questions, not questions that are going to have an inevitable answer. If you don't do that, then you will not make progress. So one of the things that I did in the research for this book, as well as reading what other people have said about this, as well as going back. I was originally a classicist, so I always go back to the ancient Greeks, and we might come. I will indeed. I'll come back. I'll definitely come back to that, particularly Socrates, the Greek philosopher. But if one of the things I did was to speak to people, a wide variety of people at the top of their game, for whom asking really smart questions is an absolute differentiator. So I spoke to Nobel Prize winning biochemist. I spoke to Queen's, now King's Counsel, a barrister. I spoke to journalists. I spoke to a Zen Buddhist sensei. Zen Buddhists, they spend a lot of time in their meditation practice asking unanswerable questions, so-called koans. What is the sound of one hand clapping, or can you fit or how would you fit a pagoda into a teapot? Those kind of impossible questions. And the point of those questions is not to get answers, but it's actually to get you to think about the very act of asking questions. I spoke to police. I spoke to an FBI hostage negotiator. All sorts of people. If they don't ask questions in the right way, market researchers, all sorts of people. If they don't ask questions in the right way, then they're not going to do their jobs properly. Mm-hmm. But I think it's broader than that. And I think that actually all of us, whatever we do, really can benefit from what I call the universal principles that come partly from my reading and from my understanding and the rest of it, but also from the direct practice of these people. So let's dive into these principles, shall we? The first one is curiosity. Now, the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, she said that she was a student of Freud. She said that humans have what she called it the epistemophilic instinct. Let's translate that. Let's make it English. They have a thirst for knowledge. Children, by the age of 5, children have asked, wherever they are in the world, about 40,000 questions that start with the word why. Anyone who's either ever brought up children or who've ever spent any time with young children will know that children say why. And what they want,
why.
But what they want to do is to work out how the world works, right? They want to know, if I pull my cat's tail, will it bite me or will it purr? If I put my sister's fingers in the socket, will it go bang and I go to what? They want to learn what's going to happen in the world. And yet, as soon as they get to school and then into the world of education and work, they're validated by giving answers rather than asking questions. And I think it's really important. This curiosity is a universal human instinct, wanting to understand the world, and too many institutions try to squash it out of us. Not saying we want you not to be curious, but if a child asks questions in class rather than gives answers, they might be, you have poor attention span, or you're not playing. Now, I understand from the teacher's perspective that they need to get through a curriculum. I understand that, but actually curiosity. And the curiosity to know how the world works is really, I think, the fundamental starting point for asking really, really, really smart questions. The next one is about open-mindedness. So I think it's really vital that we're open-minded. This is where I go back to the old irritating Socrates in 5th century Athens. Now, there was a paradox that Socrates had. Socrates wanted to find out, what was truth, what was beauty, what made the world tick. And his starting point was to say, and he said it many times, according to Plato, who Socrates wrote nothing that survives, and it's all written by Plato. So he said many times, all that I know is that I know nothing. So starting from a position of ignorance, it's not false ignorance. So, if let's say you're a market researcher, and you've been working for 20 years in the holiday industry, and you know how to ask questions of people about what type of holiday they're going to take, and you take a brief from a new client, you could say, yeah, I know how to do this. I know the market. I know the type of answers people give. I know the kind of questions I'm going to ask. If you start from a position that says, I am ignorant. I've got experience, but I'm ignorant of this particular set of questions I'm going to be asking. Or if you're a psychotherapist and you're faced with a new client, oh, it's obvious that they were abused by their friends and parents, and they were abandoned as a child. It's obvious, or they've got issues. If you don't bring those assumptions, biases, and prejudices to the questions that you ask, and instead you take an approach that says, I don't know the specifics of this case, so let's just start from that position of open-mindedness, then I think you're much more likely to ask genuinely smart questions.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you. That's a big part also of our approach, because the work that we do is to create and launch and sell online courses. And when we work with a client and they come to us and say, okay, how many sales are we going to make straight away? My answer is, I don't know. Because I can look at patterns and I can say, okay, based on your audience and based on my experience and based on the conversion rate, we could make X amount of sales. But the reason why the first time that we sell, we always do a pre-launch campaign is to actually validate how many sales we could actually make with the material, with the offer that we have created, with the material that we have done, the conversion of the landing page, and all the other parts. Because I shot myself in the foot at the beginning after I thought I knew everything. And I say, okay, I've done about like 50 of these launches. Now I understand the metrics. There is always, every business is different. There is always something that needs to be tweaked. And sometimes you get positively surprised. And sometimes you're like, I'm a bit disappointed right now. What do I need to change? So curiosity and open-mindedness, even in the launch space, is the biggest piece of advice I can give also to clients that they are launching something, because you cannot really base anything to what you've done in the past. Every launch is a different part.
That doesn't downplay for 1 second your experience and knowledge about how to build these things. But if you can park your prejudices, your assumptions, your biases at the door, I mean, I think this is particularly important in the issues, in the area of gender equality, of race equality, able-bodiedness, all of these areas. Yeah. If you think about, it's not just market researchers at all. I'm not either picking on them or saying they're particularly good, but if you write questions from the perspective of a middle-class white Western man, you're going to get answers in one area. If you think about the market that you're actually going after, and you park those assumptions and prejudices at the door, you're more likely to ask really bright questions. Which brings us to the third, and we'll fly through. The third is about preparation, and I'm sure I have no doubt you'll agree with this. But actually thinking about the questions that you're going to ask, not anticipating or second guessing what the other person is going to answer, but if you prepare. Both police and lawyers in particular, but also journalists and doctors. Doctors too. It's not about mapping out a conversation journey for I'll ask this question, then this, then this, then this, but just imagining how it's going to be. It's like the preparation of great sports people. It's about visualization of how the conversation may go, but preparing and being prepared. For it may go over here, it may go over here. If it goes over here, I need to do this. If it goes over here, I need to do that. But preparing individual questions, preparing the structure, also preparing the environment. I talk about the how as well as the what. Preparing the environment. That's really important, that people don't feel intimidated, that they feel they don't feel that there's anything in either the online or the physical environment which is going to intimidate the other person. So making sure that you think how it's going to go. As I say, that's quite a good analogy, the visualization that sports coaches will get people to have. The next one, we've talked about open-mindedness and this Socratic paradox of saying you know nothing. The next one, and this is something that so many people in so many different areas say, open questions. So not what were you doing at 9:45 or in the Dog and Duck pub with that snooker cue in your hand. What
That's
did you intend to do? It's quite leading, right? But one of the things, I spoke to a number of people involved in the police, both those at a very senior strategic level, but also those at the operational level. And one of the things that the UK police, it's not unique to the UK, but a couple of these detective sergeants were from UK police, was that they have what they call their TED formula. And the TED formula it's an acronym for three questions that they ask, which is tell, explain, describe. Or those are the beginnings. So tell me, Simone, how were you feeling on last Thursday? Can you explain where you were? Could you describe in a little bit more detail? You don't answer all of those questions together in a cluster.
Yeah.
We'll come on in the next principle. Cluster questions are an absolute no-no because people get confused. But this tell, explain, describe, they're open questions, and people want to tell stories. Even criminals that have committed heinous crimes that are going to see them behind bars for years, once they've been caught, they want to talk, even if they feel embarrassed about what they may have done or they have been caught. They want to explain it, and you just need to give them the space. But open questions, not closed. So allowing people the possibility. I'm not just talking about criminals here. I'm talking about in coaching, in developing products and services, using open questions rather than closing people down too soon. There's a case for closed questions.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you. You really, like, I was ready to ask. It's like, so where is the place for closed questions? Where shall we use them?
I think so. So when you're, we can be as broad as we like until we need to narrow down. So I think the case for closed questions is quite interesting. Both lawyers and doctors told me, and I've observed, having worked alongside both, they said, you need to give people enough space to be able to explain the situation, and then. How are you feeling today, Mr. Vincenzi? Since we saw you last, any general pain here, there, and then you say, yeah, do you know what? I felt something in my knee. Oh, can you tell me what you felt in the knee? Oh, is it a violent stabbing pain that happens at 3 a.m? Okay, then you've got condition X. So you give people the scope to be, I'm giving a kind of trivial caricatured example, but you can see from that example, you give people the breadth and the latitude to be able to explain to you what it is, and then you can bring your knowledge and understanding to get that understanding. The closed question too early will make people close down and not open up to you. The open question encourages them to do that.
So is it the rule of thumb, we can say, if there is any rules, but one we can say that we start with open questions, and then we use closed question to narrow down once we have an understanding of, and one that person also has opened up enough where we could have their information. So mainly like the closest question, they are merely to validate an assumption that we got based on the open questions.
Exactly so. Brilliantly put. Much better than I put it. The next one is the last one is about simplicity. So there's a line from Mark Twain, Winston Churchill, Oscar Wilde, that they are all said to have said, "I would have written you a shorter letter, I just didn't have the time." And I think for questions, it's related to this third principle of preparation. But for questions, if you prepare those questions and you make sure that your questions are simple, by simple I don't mean simplistic or simple-minded, but if they're straightforward questions, if they're easy to understand, if they're clear and transparent and well prepared, then the answer, then the person that you're asking the question of will know what you mean, and they'll be more likely to answer. It may take you longer to prepare and to craft.
Yes.
Just like this, writing you a shorter letter, it may take you longer to create a simple question, but actually the savings in time you will have by asking a simple question versus a complex question, you won't have to answer them again. And the more you ask people, if you ask people the same thing again and again and again in different ways, they feel that either they've got it wrong or you haven't understood them, and it either makes them close down or it makes them give answers that they think you want rather than actually the answers that are truthful answers. And I think that the worst type of question and judges in court, my lawyer friends tell me, are good at ruling these out. But the worst type of questions are cluster questions. Now, what were you doing on Thursday night? But hang on, before you answer that question, can you just remember what your mother said to you on Friday? And so you just give cluster questions. People don't know which one to answer. I mean, it's if you think of politicians being interviewed by the media, often the media will ask a cluster question, and the politician will choose the easiest question to answer.
Because the media, they might have like 20 seconds. To ask that question, so they try to cram as many information or as many things as possible.
It was really in evidence during the pandemic. You may remember the height of the pandemic, the 5 o'clock press conference. It would be now Laura Kunzberg from the BBC. What's your question? And then she'd ask 5 questions. What's happened about PPE and what about the parties and all and so just the easiest question would be answered. So be simple. And then finally, the last one isn't about asking at all. It's about listening. It's about silence. It's about genuinely giving people the space to answer questions. There's a really good TED Salon talk by a woman called Julia Dahr, and she talks about her dad, who just at the time that Donald Trump was elected president, he was a Democrat, and he went round Trump supporting states, and he asked questions that his question, and this is, I think, one of the smartest questions in the world. I know you're going to ask me those, but he said what he said was, "I never really thought about it that way before. What can you share with me that would help me see what you see?" And I think that's a really interesting question. And then he'd be quiet and he'd allow the answer to come. And what Julia Dahr says, is that to be honest, if you ask repetitive questions, cluster questions, confrontational questions, then what's going to happen is it's like you're in a fighting cage. And actually, questions shouldn't be like a fighting cage. This is not about confrontation. This is much more about, she says, much better to ask questions like a climbing wall. There's a little opportunity here. You climb up, a little more opportunity here. So listening and allowing people talk and allowing silence. I mean, this is another thing that police and lawyers use a lot, and also doctors. If you allow silence, most of us don't like silence. Most of us will fill that silence with answers that we may or may not have realized that we are revealing the truth. So it's a double-edged thing. One, you're not competing and you're allowing people to answer. But two, by creating silence, most people fill that silence.
And then they're going to give you the information because silence can be uncomfortable. It was a piece of advice that was given also one of my early sales trainers, where, say, when you're giving the proposal and you're sharing, sometimes you're mentioning the price, there can be a moment where you're now starting to talk while you wait for the client to give the answers. And I made those mistakes many times at the beginning. It's like, oh, how much it is? I say it's £10,000. And then I would start like saying, oh, it is £10,000 because we are doing this and this, while say it's £10,000. And you will find that now at that point, the client will say something.
Yep.
Will say something, and that will be the starting point of the negotiation or the conversation or what's gonna be next. So I wanted to recap now these points because then we can put them all together in one piece. So we have curiosity, so being curious, open-mindedness, so not making assumption, preparation not only of the questions but also the environment to make sure that the other person feels safe to answer the questions.
Perfect.
Open questions so that we can get the information from the clients, and then maybe using closing questions toward the end to validate maybe an assumption that we have.
Yep.
Simplicity, one question at a time, not multiple questions, and then listening, giving the space for the other person to really answer and not be afraid of the silence. And that's the 6 pillars, the 6 universal principles of asking smarter questions. And one thing that I would love to,
that's my view.
Yeah, one thing that I would love to say is that when you are selling, I bring back everything to sales and marketing.
Of course.
This is what I do. These are great ways when you're selling, you're asking questions to people, you're asking questions about them, their business or their life, depending on what you're selling. So those principles, they can be applied to any situations where you're asking questions, not only when you're doing market research, when you're doing sales, when you're doing marketing, when you're coaching your clients, when you're working with your clients. So that's what I like, is the versatility of those principles. That's what I wanted to mention.
Very good.
Now, there is before we wrap up, there is the best questions in the world to ask. Is that what you said before, or do we have another one?
Well, so I mean, I think that's a very good one. I mean, I in the book I mention 15 of what I think are the best. I mean, I think it's quite interesting to think about what are the worst. I mean, one of the worst questions, I think, whether it's at a networking event, whether it's at a first meeting with a prospective client. But one of I think the worst questions is, what do you do? Now, senior members of the royal family are allowed to do that because that's what they ask. But actually, what do you do? Almost always makes people feel resentful and feel the need to describe their job. Whereas if you say what lights you up, or how do you spend your time, or what's it like being you, you are getting them to think about themselves in the round. And so, what lights you up might be coaching my son's soccer team on a Sunday morning when it's blowing a hurricane. And but what lights you up might be closing a sale. What lights you up might be winning a court case. What lights you up might be when I finally work out what's wrong with my patient who's been coming to see me. So it allows you not to say, are you defined by what you do as a job, but it's what makes you really excited. How do you spend your time is another one. I think how do you spend your time is Darren Brown, the mesmerist Darren Brown. I think that's his favorite question rather than what do you do? What do you do really narrows us down. I think in terms of allowing ourselves time to grow and to reflect, I think there are a couple of questions that are really smart. One of these is, what can I control? So, one of the great definitions of stress is trying to control the things that you can't control. We've all been in the situation where we've been fretting and fretting and fretting. So if you think, what can I control? And what you can control is your reaction to events. You can't control events. If you think back to the height of the pandemic, wanting COVID numbers to go down so that we could go to the pub again, or whatever it might have been, so we could go and see our friends and family again. You can't control that, but you can control your reaction to that. I mean, that's one of the principles of ancient Greek and Roman Stoic philosophy. All that you can control is your reaction to events. If you can't control events, one individual, even if you're the prime minister or the world president, you can't control everything because the world is. And then the other, so that what just realizing what you can control and asking yourself. The other one I think is to have a gratitude practice, and just ask yourself at the end of every day, what 3 things am I grateful for today? You might write it down, you might say it out loud, you might say it to your partner or to your family or to your colleagues, but just asking what you're grateful for. And then on a business front, if you want to make it more business oriented, I think that the Net Promoter Score question is one of the smartest questions in the world. On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely is it that you'd recommend us to a friend or a colleague? And you just you calculate who are the 9s and 10s, and then who are the rest, and you subtract one from the other. I think that's a real smart question. So there's a variety. I mean, I think one of the most underestimated smart questions is what is called the Columbo question. Now, there was in the 70s, Lieutenant Frank Columbo, who was a sort of bumbling detective, American detective, and he would always solve the case. But the way he would always solve the case, when the villain, he thought the villain, he or she thought they got off the hook, he'd just say, kind of, just one more thing. And that's how he started his final question. And for me, the Columbo question is really, is there anything else that I haven't asked you that maybe I should have asked you? And I think that's that's the way that many doctors will find out the real reason why one of their patients has come to see them. Just when they're putting their coat on, got their hand on the door, leaving the doctor's surgery. Anything else? Do you know what? Actually, and then that is often the moment when but that can happen. That can happen in a sales conversation as well, right? So you've talked through what the challenges are, what they're facing. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that we can help you with? Is there anything else that's bothering you right now? And then suddenly, blah, it all comes out.
I used to have a sales trainer that used to teach us the Colombo close, and when there is someone, and that to be used in situations where you are there and there is a good rapport with that client, with that potential clients, but somehow the deal is not moving forward, and say, okay, I can see that we might not have a deal now, so maybe this is not working. But let me just ask you one more question, and then say, if there was one thing that we could do together to work, to just get started the process, what would it be? The amount of sales that question gave me, you have no idea.
Brilliant.
I can say a good 200,000 worth of sales. They have been closed by me asking that question.
Perfect.
That has been so Colombo. We like the Colombo sale, the Colombo close, or in this case, the Colombo questions. Now, this has been a masterclass on asking question, and definitely in the book there is much more to it, much more depth, much more details, more examples of questions. So before we wrap up, tell us how we can find the book, what people can expect also in the book as well, and what is that you're covering there.
Sure. Well, I mean, so of course, anybody
that might
who
have
writes
been
a book
like a cluster question, actually.
Well,
about two questions in one. Now I'm aware of it.
So where you can find it is asksmarterqs.com. qs.com, asksmarterqs.com. As I said, there is a lot in there. There are 15, 16 interviews with the type of experts that I've been talking about. Of course, anyone who writes a book about questions, and there are several books about questions, but anyone who writes a book about questions, every chapter has to be a question. There are some fantastic jokes in the footnotes, let me tell you. I think that I've written 3 business books, one on data storytelling, one on insightful thinking, and this one on asking smarter questions. As I say, I wrote them in the wrong order, but no, you won't tell anyone that.
Now the trilogy is completed.
The trilogy is complete. But I think it is the most fundamental and the most broadly applicable, because if you do follow those principles that we've gone through about curiosity and open-mindedness and so on and so forth, this can help you be a better partner. It can help you be a better parent or child. It can help you be a better neighbor. It can help you be a better colleague in whatever line of work you work in. And you said at the beginning, you talked about making every question count, making your organization, making your life less confrontational, more collaborative, more productive. I think we all have more fun when we get on. And I'm not trying to be kind of tree hugging and happy clappy and say, but it's much more fun when there's less confrontation and there's more collaboration, because the potential of 1 + 1 is very much more than 2, and the potential of 7-8 billion plus the rest of us is very much more. So I think that I think you'll get a real sense of optimism. So there are some good jokes. They're not all mine, but there are some good jokes, particularly in the footnotes. But it's kind of an attitude of life that if you do put a little bit more effort into the questions that you ask, and specifically pausing to listen to let the other person answer, then you're going to be very much more likely to have more fun and a better time.
So that's asking smarter questions, and we can find it at asksmarterqs.com. So it's asksmarterqs.com, and you will also find the link in the show notes. So you can scroll down, you can click the link and find the resources and definitely get the book. Sam, it has been an incredible interview. I loved what you shared, the 6 principles, the best questions also in the world to ask. And thank you for being here on the show and helping me as well ask smarter questions.
Thank you so much for the time. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been an enormous pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe to the channel and subscribe to the podcast. Also, leave us a review. They're really important. They're the lifeblood of the show. And last but not least, until next time, always remember that together we grow exponentially. Ciao.